Hello everyone, my name is Anton Johnson. I'm a senior level designer at King, and today I'm going to talk about level design in match-3 games. But before we get started, just a little bit about me. I've always loved games, and when I was 15-year-old, around 15-year-old, I discovered that you can actually make your own games, which was a mind-blowing moment for 15-year-old me. I downloaded programs, I started making my own games, I did my own art, and I never really stopped from there. I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in game development at the University of Skövde here in Sweden, and at the end of that, I got an internship at King as a level design intern. And I've been working in the mobile game industry for about 5 years since then. Mostly at King, but I also joined a startup called Solve for a brief time before that company ended up closing down their game division. I came back to King. I'm currently working in the Farm Heroes Saga team at King. And Farm Heroes Saga, for those of you not familiar, is one of King's older titles. We actually celebrated our 10th anniversary earlier this year, so happy birthday, Farm. It's a match-3 game, similar to Candy Crush, but it has a farm theme. So instead of candies, we have these cropsies, which are things you would grow on a farm, like apples, carrots. We have sunshine, we have water. It's all very cute. As a game that sort of manages to stay relevant, continues to growing after 10 years, Farm, there's a lot of challenges. And one of the things Farm continues to do is release new features, new events, new optimization, and of course, new levels. And to release new levels, you need level design. And as a senior level designer, as a level designer in general, it's something very dear and near to my heart. And one of the things I like to use as like analogy for level design, it's a bit like building with Legos. You can have a very limited pack, because Lego is expensive. You don't have too much. At least I didn't have growing up. You have a limited amount of Legos, and you have a limited amount of mechanics in your game. But level design is all about using them in new ways. So like when you start putting those Legos in different configurations and orders and rotations, and suddenly you have thousands of possibilities from just these few bricks or these few mechanics. Farm Hero Saga releases 60 levels every month or 15 levels every week. Similarly to how other games introduce new characters, new maps, new expansions, or even sequels to stay relevant. Having this continuous stream of content, though, comes with some challenges, especially for level design. How do we make sure that the levels we add to the game feel fresh and new? How do we make sure the levels are fun to play? From level 1 to level 1000 to level 2000 and beyond. And this is where I think level design is so fascinating, because it really is about doing more with less. In Farm Hero Saga, we have built over 6,000 levels using practically the same elements. And finding new ways to keep it fresh, to find new combos, new ways to build levels, it's a true level design challenge, and it never feels like you've solved it all. There's always more optimizations to do, new ways to think about it, and the players and the game evolves around you. And in this talk, I hope to talk to you about some of these intricacies, like how do we use common level design principles in a match-3 game? How do we design what is a good level, what is a bad level? And I hope you'll be able to get something really useful out of it, because I think it's really cool and something you might not think about being so designed as it is. During my 5 years in the mobile game industry, I've been fixated on one thing in particular, and it's these 8x8 tiles that make up all of the levels in Farm Hero Saga. I've been staring at these tiles for 5 years, because it's been my duty to create, to review, to optimize these levels. Levels that could look something like this. And before we go any further, 8x8 tiles is not exactly the standard for board sizes in match-3 games. Farm uses a 8x8 tile, but Candy Crush, for example, uses a 9x9 grid, and there are games that currently use 11x9, 12x9. It doesn't really matter, and I think it's only more impressive what we're able to accomplish in Farm using just an 8x8 grid. But I wanted to highlight that there is other grid types as well, but I'm gonna focus on the 8x8s of Farm. Throughout my time at King, I've become intimately familiar with match-3 puzzle design, but I understand that to some of you it might look fairly simple. There are only so many tiles, there are only so many elements, there are only so many possible combinations. But that could not be any further from the truth. Using our old friend math, there are 64 tiles in total on our Farm Hero Saga Match 3 board, and there are around 75 different entities that we can place on it, counting different layers of the same element. 64 to the power of 75 gives us this massive number. It's over 100 characters long, and it's the amount of possible level combinations in Farm Hero Saga. It's quite hard to grasp what it is. Especially, like, what is this number even called? Well, it's called this. I hope that cleared it up for you, now that you can properly grasp it. It's so big that there's actually way more level configurations possible in Farm Hero Saga than there are stars in the universe, by a massive amount. In fact, there are more level configurations possible in Farm Hero Saga than there are estimated atoms in the universe. Still, by a lot. And I'm sure that at least one quadrigantillion of these levels are utterly awful. What I wanted to show you with this example is that there is a lot of opportunities and a lot of choices within our game board of 8x8 tiles. But when designing any game, there are an enormous amount of choices presented. How do we navigate all of these decisions? That's where level design comes in. In the examples here, these three vastly different games still use some of the same core level design principles. We have progression. In chess, you start with a full set of pieces at your side, but as the game progresses, you start chipping away at your opponent's arsenal, and the pieces go from being, at these very different parts of the board to being interlocked in the middle. In Zelda, your journey throughout the world, you get stronger, you beat bosses, and you collect items. You progress, and there's a very difference between the beginning and the end of the game. And the same in Farm. As you start a level, there's a lot of things on it, usually cluttered with blockers and flowers and all these things, but as you play, you clear away more and more of this, opening up the board. Flow. The way combat flows in Zelda, for example, there's a lot of various inputs, there's reflexes involved, there's strategy, and it's not entirely dissimilar to the flow of strategies in chess. As you play, you need to counter your opponent, there's a lot of choices at every turn, and the flow of the game of chess, although very different from Zelda in its sort of speed, it's still a very core part of it, as you need to counteract and counterplay against your opponent. And in Farm, there's also a flow of sorts. As the game board changes and shifts with your moves, you need to combat and work with the flow of the game, and you need to control it to your advantage. There's also variety, and all these games have variety built into them, in the level design as well. Different pieces have different moves in chess. If all the pieces in chess were pawns, it would be a quite boring game. There's different enemies and items and locales in Zelda, and the same way in Farm, there's different pieces, there's blockers, there's boosters, offering you a sense of variety in the levels and in the level-to-level experience. Lastly, there's challenge. All of these games offer a challenge of sort, be it strategy in chess or action in Zelda. All these games have an element of difficulty to them. Sometimes it comes from the game, sometimes it comes from your opponent, like in chess, but the level design helps support that difficulty and is built around it. Instead of making it a strictly frustrating experience, it strives to make it challenging, though I'm sure some players would be frustrated regardless. The focus of this presentation is to show you how we make use of these concepts in Farm Hero Saga, and hopefully give you some more insight into how level design can be applied in different ways across different types of games. So I want to invite you to join me on a journey deep within this 8x8 grid, where I hope to show you the intricacies that go into designing a level for a match-3 game, with the hopes that you can be inspired to think of new ways to apply your knowledge and design principles in your own games and future. I am sure most of you have already played a match-3 game sometime in your life, but if you're not familiar, I will very quickly go through the basics. The main element of Farm are the cropsies, These are identical in behavior to the candies, the gems, the cookies, and all manner of other things that are used in match-3 games. These are our core elements, and they appear in distinctive colors, and they will fall down onto the board, and you can match them. The core mechanic of Farm is switching place with 2 adjacent cropsies. If there are 3 or more of the same color in a row, they create a match, and they get collected. As cropsies are collected, new ones fall in to take their place. Aside from cropsies, we also have what we call blockers. These are elements on the board that are not collected by matching 3 of the same colors, and must be collected in other ways. Most common is to make matches with cropsies adjacent to a blocker. There are many different ones, and I won't go into too much details on individual behavior. If you've played a match-3 game, you should be able to understand how most of these work, though, in Farm. I have now been able to explain to you what a level is, the components used for its construction and design. Now, I'm sure most of you knew what a level was before this, so I won't disappoint you by ending my talk here. The next question I have is something far more complex to answer, though. What is a good level? A cornerstone of good match-3 levels is a sense of progression. Progression is the preceding procession of progress. But how do we achieve these things in a match-3 game, like Farm Hero Saga? Well, there are certainly external systems that gives you a sense of progression. How many levels have you beaten? How many gold bars do you have? How much soft currency do you have? But no, important as they may be, the focus of today is on the intrinsic sense of progression we can achieve inside of each level during each attempt the player makes. Each level in Farm Hero Saga has a number of targets required to beat the level. This is one of the easiest ways we can track the player's progression in each level. If the player has achieved half of their targets, we can say they have progressed halfway through the level. But it is important not to stare too much on the numbers at the top of the screen. Our players certainly don't. Their eyes are transfixed on the game board below. And here is where we can really have an impact with our design. To build a satisfying progression, we need to build it into the game board itself, using the various elements at our disposal. As the level progresses, the player should unlock more and more tiles to make matches. The progression has a direct impact on the player's available options, so changing the board will really make the player feel the sense of progression. And it's very clear how far the player has come by just looking at how much of the board has opened compared to how it was at the start. The placement of blockers and the allotment of their layers help build a fundamental sense of progression inside of each level. When a player starts a level, it's filled with blockers, it's obstacles, but they are not obstacles to progress. In Farm Hero Saga and most modern match-3 games, the blockers are a part of the goal as well, so we should not view them merely as blockers. Blockers, the name is not perhaps the best, because blockers are not detrimental to progress. Blockers are progress. And how do we construct a good sense of progression then? To properly discuss that, we must first understand one more concept: flow. When viewing progression, it can be seen a bit as like a loading bar, where we can tell how far the player is from the goal. The player starts with no targets acquired, and at the end they would have completed all of their targets. I like to describe flow as progression over time. If we watch how fast a player progresses through a level, we can see in which part of the level progress is moving faster, where it's moving slower, and thus how it flows. Flow is a core part of level design, regardless of what game you're working on. All games depend on flow to create an enjoyable experience. In multiplayer games, for example, the level designers create a map in such a way that the natural flow of the game creates conflicts and skirmishes and pushes the players to make certain tactical decisions and choices. In a platforming game like Mario here, level designers can create a good sense of flow by carefully placing obstacles so that players can continue to run and keep their momentum if they time their jumps right. This example probably feels quite natural to you, but perhaps you haven't really thought about how flow functions when you play a match-3 game like Farm Hero Saga or Candy Crush. The principle stands very much strong for us in Farm Hero Saga as well, and there are several things to think about when designing good flow in a match-3 puzzle game. A good flow is signified by few to no moments where progression is completely halted. Ideally, every move the player makes should move you some measure closer towards the goal. Actions that do not aid in progression feel wasted and unsatisfying. Progression that is entirely linear as well would also be incredibly boring. You want those moments of up and down, but it should never be completely stuck. For example, in this level we can see that every move made outside of this circled area would not help you collect these flowers, because you need to match next to the flowers to collect them. Moves outside the area are completely useless, which leads to a very bad sense of progression and flow if the player has no choice but to make matches there, because there's no other matches available. So aside from avoiding these big gaps in progression, what does a good flow look like? The flow at the start of each level is amongst the most important. We want our players to play as much of our levels as possible, and we don't want them to quit. When a player has just started a level, they are the least invested in that level that they'll ever be, and they are the most likely to quit, either to restart or to go do something else if they feel frustrated in that initial stage. The chance to churn increases. So to prevent this, the beginning should always offer a great sense of progression. This can be achieved by having many easy to destroy blockers in the start, or easy to achieve objectives. By the time the player reaches the more difficult aspects of the level, they'll be able to look back at their progress and see, wow, I made it so far, the rest should be doable too. And so we increase the likelihood that the player continues to play through the rest of the level. On the other end of the spectrum, if the player loses a level, we want them to feel that winning is within reach. If winning feels possible, frustration is lessened. The flow of the level should help guide the player to an end where, even if they don't win, they feel like they could have. So by balancing the later part of the level to be a bit more difficult, we ensure that the other parts of the level are easier to complete. So when the player gets towards the end, either they win, or if they lose, they feel like they could have won. In a level with good progression, when looking back at the level you've just lost or won, you'll see how far you've come. The view of the level on the first move versus the last move is striking, and that is satisfying. You can see as a player that you've had an impact. Your moves, your strategies changed the levels. So even if you lost, you're able to tell the difference you had on this game. And you're able to start again, and you can see that through to the end. There is no perfect flow that fits all levels. And all different kinds of levels will have different curves and strategies. But there are decent principles that can be used to guide yourself in the right directions. Level where the progression is stagnant or very lopsided could feel off to play or not as satisfying. So amending these things could really help improve the player experience of your levels. Another aspect of good level design in match-3 games is variety. Farm has one single core mechanic in its levels. One way for the player to interact with the levels. You switch something, trying to make matches of 3 or more. So how do we deliver variety to our players? Well, some of you might think, just use different elements in different levels. And that's a great thought. Making sure the level-to-level experience is varied is really important. But what I want to talk about today is how we provide variety inside of a single level. How do we design for variety? Well, using level design, of course. The first and most obvious answer is to use different elements within the level. But simply throwing a bunch of different blockers in there is not going to provide a meaningful sense of variety by default. One useful way to look at variety in a level is to, again, look at the time spent in the level. If we split the level into 4 sections, each representing a fourth of the player's moves, we can examine what the player is doing on a given level and see if that level offers a good sense of variety throughout its runtime. In this first level example, we have flowers, we have apples and carrots as the main targets. As a player starts the level, there are these flowers on the board and there's the apples and carrots to collect. But the flowers disappear very quickly, and so in the second part of the level, there's no flowers. You end up just collecting apples and carrots. In the third one, the same thing. You just end up grinding these carrots and apples. And the same is true for the fourth, where you either win or lose depending on how many carrots and apples you've collected. Looking at the overall segment of this level, we notice that, yeah, there is some different stuff happening in the beginning, but after that, it is the same thing throughout, with no meaningful variety. This is the level with low variety. In the second example, we have a different level, where there's a lot of weeds on the board, and carrots and apples. As you play through the first part, you discover that behind the weeds are also fireflies. So in the second part of the level, you need to collect the rest of the weed that you can reach, and the fireflies who are now also blocking your way. At the same time, you're also collecting the flowers, the apples and the carrots. In the third section, you cleared all the weeds, but to get further, you need to collect all the fireflies, because they will be removed all at once. During the fireflies, you still have the apples and the carrots, and once the fireflies are removed in the fourth section of the level, you have the weeds again, giving you back something different to do at the end of the level, while continuing to collect the apples and the carrots. In this level, we can see quite a high amount of variety. For each stage of the level, there's something different going on compared to the one before. Even if it's only two different elements, aside from the apples and the carrots, the way they are layered and the way they are introduced in the level creates a more satisfying flow and variety. Each level does not need to have a very clear sections or gates like with the fireflies and the weeds, but it is important that the player is engaged throughout the span of the level. We've found that levels are more engaging when there offer some sort of variety of tasks throughout its time span. It's true that sometimes just making matches can be rewarding with combos, explosions and chain reactions, but those are also things that player will grow used to over long periods of time in your game. So variety is something very useful to keep in mind for the later parts of the saga. Moving on from variety, failure is frustrating, but always succeeding is not engaging. When designing a level, it is sometimes impossible to strike that perfect balance between challenging but not frustrating. The key to making it challenging rather than frustrating lays again in mastering flow and progression. What causes frustration in a level in a match-3 game? Well, one of the things could be that it looks impossible to win. If the player looks at the level, the amount of moves they have, and feels like it's impossible to win, without spending money or boosters or EGPs, that's a huge source of frustration. Each level should ideally feel winnable at the start. Another thing is not making any progress. If your player is playing through the level and not making any progress at all, that is a source of frustration. We want to eliminate what we call wasted moves, when the player only has matches in areas where you don't actually make any progress. Thirdly, if it's too luck dependent or a lack of agency, if the player feels like the level is entirely reliant on luck, that can cause frustration. If the player feels like they don't have any agency, there won't be any satisfaction from their eventual victory either. Losing again and again through no fault of your own is not a good player experience. And match-3 games are they have a big element of luck and chance in them. They have a lot of randomness. But it is important to balance how much of luck is needed to progress and beat a level versus skill and strategy. Another thing that plays an important part in frustration and balancing is time. Time spent in levels. Hard levels are always going to be more frustrating by default. A more difficult challenge is going to pose a bigger barrier to players. But if those levels are also very long, that can cause even more than frustration, just fatigue, because the player ends up replaying and playing the level again and again because it's a really hard one, and if that level is also very long, that's going to cause problems. We found that it's easier to make the hard levels feel a bit shorter so that the attempts aren't as long because you'll be making more of them. In conclusion, although deceptively simple, there are a lot of things that goes into designing a match-3 level for a game like Farm Hero Saga. With the sheer magnitude of possibilities, we can use our design principles of progression, flow, variety and challenge to build a better experience for our players. To me, It is such a fascinating puzzle, trying to strike that perfect balance between all of these things. It is a web of interconnected elements, where there are still plenty of room for design discussions, experimentation, and research to what is the most optimal way to build a level and to tailor an experience to our players. And despite all this complexity, to the player, it is so exceedingly simple. Just a board of 8x8 tiles. I hope I've been able to show you a deeper look, or at least a glance, into what goes into these tiles in your match-3 games. And hopefully, you'll be able to utilize some of these learnings on your own projects in some way. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.